Yo, listen up, here's the story about a little guy that lives in a blue world. Inside and outside, through his house with the blue little window.
There's some things that you're probably going to need. You first want to start out with a regular eraser, a kneaded eraser, and a pencil. I didn't have a pencil at this time, so I used a fish as a substitute. For paper, I'm using a nice thick watercolor paper with a fine tooth. Next, you're going to want to grab some pens, in addition to some form of watercolor brush. For coloring, I'm using watercolor markers and regular watercolors, and also some crayons because they're fun. I'll also be using Sharpies of different sizes and white gel pens for highlighting. You can find these easily at any craft store, but if you can't find them, just don't be afraid to use some whiteout. If you do plan on using a gel pen, I would recommend the Jelly Roll. Last but not least, you're going to want to get a fidget spinner to dab on the haters. So getting started, you're first going to want to start out with your nice thick piece of paper. Feel free to search through images on Google to gain inspiration on what your mermaid might look like. I like to imagine that no two mermaids look the same and have different kinds of colors and fin types. You may find a piece of art you like and can be inspired from that, but don't copy straight from that artist, because that's plagiarism. Now that you know kind of what a mermaid looks like, you can look up some fish to get inspiration for what the fins might look like. I'm going with a betta fish for this drawing. I'm also going to try and incorporate some of the fins' colors. I start by cutting the watercolor paper in half and then placing tape along all edges of the paper. I'm placing the tape like this so that when we're done with the drawing, we'll pull the tape up and it will add a nice clean border to our piece of art. If you're using a thinner piece of paper and are afraid of warping, feel free to tape your paper down to a solid surface, like a table or a desk, but not where anybody else may be using it, because that would be rude. My camera angles are so bad, I am so sorry. Now that we know what our clean border looks like, it's time to start with a nice gesture drawing. Since this is a mermaid and she is a fictional being, I took some creative liberties with the anatomy of the human part of the mermaid. So Our Lady has some lovely curves and lots of muscle in her hips, buttocks, and fins. You can also experiment with the placements of fins all over the mermaids besides her tail. In addition to a fish-like ear that turned out really bad, I also added a little belt line around her waist to differentiate the human aspect and the fish aspect of her body. I also gave her a couple little accessories like seaweed. Starting with the first layer of color, I used some pink around the base lines of her tail, and along the outer ends of the fins, I used more blues. Working with it more, I layered in some lighter greens and lighter blues, and then I blended it with a watercolor marker. This marker I got that holds water so I don't have to dip it constantly, but it's basically a watercolor paintbrush. If you're using similar colors to mine, you may notice the colors blending together to make a very faint violet color. That's okay if it turns a little purple. We're going to layer more colors into it later. For her upper body, I started out with some dark blues and then blended that out so that it gave it a grayish blue color. You may notice that I'm also using a colorless blender in addition to my watercolor brush. Why didn't I mention that before? I don't know, I forgot. Since the fins have begun to dry a little bit, I decided to go and touch up unblended areas in the fins. Once you're confident enough with the fins on her upper body, I'm going to start on the lower body. For this, I'm using a bunch of dark grays that I'm going to, you guessed it, blend. Don't be afraid if it doesn't look very fish-like yet, because once this is dry, we're going to go back in and add some nice scales.
Stop at the store. You want to stop at the store after?
No, why do I want to stop at the store?
Mama, I'm recording and you turned the light out on me.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Getting ready to leave now?
Recording. Yeah,
Let me finish watering this.
Watering. Is it a plant?
I'm blending it. Yes, it is a plant.
It's a plant.
As you're watching here, I finished blending out some of the colors, and then I was kidnapped by my family to go out and eat. It was a very nice time, and I got to witness a beautiful moment like this mailbox, as well as this delicious peanut butter chocolate ice cream.
Why do so many people want to come here? It's not that good quality.
After we battled the long line at the ice cream place, it was time to resume my work. So I decided to start next on the seaweed. I don't know why the seaweed, but the seaweed. All I'm doing is just coloring it in with some greens. And then I'm going through and coloring it in with more greens. After I finished with the seaweed, I went back through and added some shadows to the body of our mermaid with a very faint blue wash that I made with watercolor paint. And this is part one of me destroying her face. It goes downhill from here. Don't copy any of this. Just don't. Yeah, no. Just while editing, I made myself so nauseous going back through and watching myself destroy this poor mermaid's face. I then decided to layer the rest of the mermaid's body with blue wash and then use that wash to make little circles that will later be bubbles once the dots have dried. If you don't know how to make blue wash, it's a lot of water and just a tiny, tiny bit of watercolor. You can make a wash with almost any kind of liquid. Anyway, I decided to go back through and darken out some of the fins with this blue wash that I have made to add a little bit more shadow and depth so that we can layer more on later. Oh, stop with the face. Here was where I got really gutsy and I decided to add straight black to the belt line and to her tail. After messing with that awful face a little bit more and then blending out some more of the colors and shadows in the tail, it was time for me to start on the hair. I liked the really nice curly black hair for our mermaid this time. I thought that a nice solid black base of hair would be a good start and a nice contrast to the rest of her body. You'll also notice that I'm working in very tiny circles. Well, you can't really see it, but it helps prevent streak marks from the Sharpies. I'm also not pressing down very hard to keep from bleeding through. Don't worry about any details yet because we're going to get to that later after I mess with this stupid face a little bit more. Oh, why did I do this? Stop. I then decided to make a green watercolor wash and use that to make a little nice saturated detail in some of the bubbles and of course layer it back on this face. Then I went back through with the nipple end of my watercolor marker and added little streaks for the fin lines. You can do this with a few different colors, but try and keep it close to the color range that you're already working in. As an example, you'll see me in this section use a mixture of reds, blues, and greens to try and add a little bit more depth. Also here I'm just touching up bubbles. While I continue to fill out some more of these tiny details, I'll explain a good way to fix any errors you might make in watercolor. If you ever make a big boo-boo in watercolor, like I did with this awful face, there is a very easy repair tool called a lift technique that will help reverse it to an extent. While your watercolor is still wet, you can take a napkin or a rag and gently pat on the area that is still wet that you hate. It should lift up some of the color and make it easier to redo. Now you're probably asking why I didn't do that with this mermaid face. Well, I didn't have any napkins on hand and I was too lazy to get up. Once you feel like you're finished detailing, feel free to go back through it with your brush and blend back out some of the colors. Give it a nice little wispy, wavy fin detail going on. Now, if you're watching this and you don't currently have any watercolor pens available like this, but you do have the watercolor paper and don't want to just work with regular watercolors, I would recommend getting you some Crayola water-based markers. Specifically, the fine tip markers work the best. They blend almost identical to watercolor pens, and they're twice as cheap, if not even more cheap. Also, if you don't have watercolor paper, use some multi-purpose paper or Bristol paper. So this is the part where I really start defining the shadows in the mermaid, as you can see. I'm working with a lot of dark blues and blending that out to really help define the shadows and the form of the mermaid's upper body. Now you're going to want to grab some of your pens from before and find the finest tip that you can find and just begin outlining the mermaid. Don't worry if it's hard to see. As long as you start small, you can always work bigger. That way it's easier to cover any mistakes that you might make. I'm not doing a lot of details on the profile of the face yet due to it still looking like hot garbage, but I am still doing details around the ear as well as little stray wispies, as Jojo Siwa calls it, in the hair. I wouldn't always recommend slowly working in the facial profile with only pen. Usually I would recommend gesture drawing it first, lightly with a pencil, but I'm impulsive, and I don't know why I did that. To work in the shapes of beta-like fins, I am going back through and adding tiny lines to be little creases or folds in the fin lines. When doing this step of outlining, you're going to want to find a nice, good pen that won't run or smear if it gets wet, because there's a good chance that you're probably going to go back over this with another layer of watercolors or ink wash, and you don't want to have black streaks running through your mermaid. Also, for doing the patterns and the seaweed, I realized I had no idea what seaweed really looked like other than what I had seen in Minecraft, so I ended up Googling different types of seaweed, and then I just took artistic liberty with that. I'm realizing now that I think that's kelp in Minecraft, not seaweed. Now this is the part where we go through and outline all the little bubbles, because at this point the little ink wash spots should be dry enough. All I'm basically doing is I'm drawing a circle, and in the top same corner of every single bubble, I'm doing a tiny little semicircle to act as a reflection. Once you are done drawing in the outline of the bubbles, grab your kneaded eraser and look for any splotches of color outside of the lines that you just outlined your mermaid with. Doing this can help you see any other areas that you might have missed hitting with the pen. And if you see any bits of watercolor that weren't picked up by the kneaded eraser, try and gently blend it out with your colorless blender or with your watercolor brush, but a small watercolor brush. If you're seeing any other bugs or errors that aren't picked up by your brush or eraser, don't worry about it, because we'll go back over it when we work on our background. Once again, I am returning to this godforsaken face to redeem any lost qualities. So I'm blending back out some blues to make it somewhat match the rest of her body. Now it is time to work on the scales, which is what I was most afraid of. After I searched for some reference images on Google, I decided to trace out a light grid over top of the shape of the tail. That way that when I actually worked on the scale shape, it would follow the form of the tail and not just stay in a straight frame. Make sure to pay attention to the position that your mermaid's tail is in so that the frame of the scales stay rather consistent. Once the grid was completed, I decided to go down each row and try and individually draw each scale. The first row didn't start out very well, and around the waistline, things got really funky. If you're doing a similar technique that I am doing and you're noticing that it's looking exactly like this and it's really bad, don't worry, because once we go back over it with different colors and shades, it'll lose some of that tackiness. While you're still working on this awful process, and to keep yourself from driving off the cliff of insanity, start thinking about different colors and shapes that you're going to turn your scales into. If you're wondering if drawing these scales is the worst thing that you've ever done, it's not. Editing yourself drawing these scales is the worst thing you've ever done. Okay, finally, now that we have the outlines of the scales done, it's time to go in and start adding highlights and shadows and or colors. I found that there's no perfect way to color in scales unless you're doing a hyper-realistic drawing, which in this case, I'm not a masochist or a sadist, so I'm not drawing a hyper-realistic drawing. I'm first using this dark blue, but then I realized that we're missing something. Yes, it is time for the crayon. Find about 3 or 4 colors that are within the color range of your mermaid's tail. My coloring and shading method is based loosely off of the infamous Rainbow Fish, a wonderful children's book about communism, and I liked the idea of sporadic random colors all over the mermaid. And now it is time for gel pens. After I had an intense rave with all of my drawing utensils, I grabbed a lighter marker that is not as an opaque of a pen and used that to start accenting some scales. I went over them a couple times to bolden them out each time, as you can see here. I then decided to go in and add highlight to some of the areas in the fins and the body. When doing this part, please make sure that everywhere on your drawing area is completely dry. Also, don't be afraid to add little streaks of hair highlights, just like I did here, even though it didn't turn out very well. If you're working with whiteout, I wouldn't recommend doing the highlighting in the fins right away, at least not as much as I've been doing, because if it gets too bright, it can really take away some of the colors in the fins. So now I pulled out a light green and a gray crayon, and I'm using that to bring out colors around the face area and around in the chest and the body as well. Try not to press too hard when working with the crayons. And now to completely contradict myself, I'm trying to add some more white to make the body of the mermaid stand out more from the tail. And then over top of that, I will be adding more grays and greens. In here, all I'm doing is going in with the nipple end of my dark blue pen, and I'm adding deeper shadows to the bubbles. So I went and revived my green ink wash, because at this point it had dried out, and I decided to add a light coat of green wash over top of the tail of the mermaid. And it wasn't until I was already halfway through painting this that I remembered that the dark blue marker that I put on earlier is a watercolor marker, so that kind of ran, but my fate was decided and I stayed with it. For the first layer of the background, I decided to go with a light sunshine or dandelion yellow, whichever one that is. And I just very lightly, and I emphasize lightly, went over the background. And I made sure to still get in the details around each fin and bubble. Personally, yellow is my absolute favorite color, but since this is a mermaid and she's underwater, yellow water isn't really a thing, it's something else. Since we didn't want it to look like our mermaid was swimming in lemonade, I went back and revived the green wash again and went back through our yellow background. So it has a greenish yellow kind of vibe going on. Be mindful of where you put down your watercolor wash, because you don't want that to smear and blend into any fins or bubbles or any other part of the mermaid. If you notice it start to pool in any areas, don't touch that area and move on to another dry area that you haven't hit yet. And then once it's dry, go back over and do another coat or two of ink wash. But between every layer, make sure it's dry because you don't want to tear up any paper or cause any more warping. I've always really loved the effect of uneven watercolors in crayon because the wax doesn't absorb any of the colors from the watercolor. So I really was going for an uneven, imperfect background. Plus, I didn't want it to be too dark because I didn't want it to take away from our mermaid. Once everything dries, I grabbed my Jelly Roll pen that I had mentioned earlier. Since that is a little bit more opaque, I went back through and added some more streak in the hair. After I was finished, I went back and I started touching up little areas of the scales, specifically not coloring in scales, but outlining any scales that got lost. I did mess up on a couple of scales, which I still resent myself for. So once I was finished with the gel pen, I'm going to go back over them with a marker. If you're using a finer tip gel pen, make sure to go in and also add tiny highlights and streaks in the fins and spots on her arm. I had also noticed that her hair was beginning to look very Bride of Frankenstein. So once I'm finished with the gel pen, I'm going to go back and fix that Bride of Frankenstein look because she may be a monster, but she's not a human monster, she's a sea monster. To fix her Bride of Frankenstein hair, I solidified some of the white streaks into one big white chunk, and just for fun, instead of filling that back in with Sharpie, I decided to go in with that dark blue again. I also hit some other streaks that I didn't really like. Now that I am all finished with drawing and everything has dried, I started pulling off our tape borders. Make sure to do this slowly, not only to prevent ripping, but this is the most satisfying step in making art, so really take it in. Try not to pull directly up on the tape either, but pull to the side. See, why am I doing that? Why? Okay, see there. I have found that the easiest places that rip are the corner areas and places next to heavy layers of watercolor. Even if your paint has dried in that area, it still is much more vulnerable to ripping because it's not as strong as it was before it was used. Our one last step is to sign, and voila.
you don't know where to go to, why don't you go where fashion sits? Putting on the Ritz. Different types who wear a day coat, pants with stripes